I heard you on Lex. I was completely hypnotized. I heard you on Lex Friedman, and I thought that ancient Rome probably has a lot to teach us about marketing, about perception, about branding, about sales, about influence. I think a lot of people have a simplified view of ancient Rome. You think swords, you think togas, but how would you describe the level of sophistication that Rome had when it came to shaping public perception and influence?
Well, Rome, I would say, had a great deal of sophistication. And um, really, I guess it operated at two levels. So, first of all, there was how individual Romans would attempt to kind of craft their image to other Romans. So, image making within the context of Roman society. And then the sort of broader level is how the Romans, sort of collectively as a people, attempted to portray themselves to others. And at both of those levels, certainly by, I would say, the late Republic, so that's the first century BC, by that point, the Romans are very keenly aware of what today I suppose we might call public image. So, kind of just to look at that first internal, personal level to start with, it's important to keep in mind that politics at Rome was fiercely competitive. So you had all these different kind of aristocrats, people like Julius Caesar and Cicero and Mark Antony and Pompey the Great, who were all striving with one another for power. And in that pursuit of power, they are constantly comparing their status to their peers. So, sort of their popularity. So, in the sense of public image was everything to a Roman politician. And they had this neat kind of word that doesn't translate very well into English called dignitas. And dignitas was the sum total of your status, your reputation, your public standing. Dignitas was how much people were gossiping about you at any given time. And this is what drove Roman politics, is the quest for dignitas. So there were a myriad ways that you could gain dignitas. You could gain dignitas if you won a successful military campaign, if you gave a good speech to the people or in the Senate, if you won a high profile law case, if you built a new public building and dedicated it to the building or to the people, if you put on gladiator games, if you simply did anything that kept you in the public eye. And sometimes this could be negative stuff too. I mean, even if you do something that's sort of scandalous, if you had an affair or something, still people are talking about you. So in some ways, it's kind of like the modern notion of a celebrity index. It's all that publicity, good and bad. And the problem with Dignitas is it's a zero sum game. So only so many people are going to be getting talked about by the public at any one moment. So if you sort of become more of a focus of public attention, probably somebody else has lost it. And this is why it was so intensely competitive. So if that's the engine driving Roman society, this quest for dignitas, all the ways that you could try to gain or lose it, it became enormously important to the Romans. So they were constantly thinking about their standing in society. And this is why they developed a lot of quite sophisticated techniques to appeal to people. So every Roman politician was formally trained for years in oratory, public speaking, because it was so important when you got up in public that you were able to be compelling, to be charismatic, to stir up the emotions of a crowd. And all this had to do with, shaping the public's opinion. There's a great quote by the Roman statesman Cicero, and he was lived in the first century BC, right at the time of all these famous people, and he was kind of in modern terms almost a gossip monger. He really closely watched all the rumors about all the politicians, and one time when he was away from Rome, he wrote a letter back to his best friend who was at Rome, this guy Atticus, and in his letter he says, please tell me in detail the reception that each politician got when he entered the theater. So he wanted to hear how loud the applause was, how long it lasted, if the actors made any jokes about that politician. Because Cicero said the best way to gauge the popularity of a person is the reception they get when they enter the theater. So it really is that, constantly changing, always has to be updated public standing. So yeah, I mean, the Romans had a very sophisticated understanding of this. They used all kinds of techniques to try and adjust their status.
This method of marketing is so effective, I had to make sure it wasn't against Google's rules before I kept doing it. It's a form of SEO I call compact keywords. Whereas most SEO focuses on putting up articles to answer questions how, what, when, compact keywords focuses on putting up dozens of pages that sell to searchers who are actually looking to buy. These pages rank on Google and convert so much better than normal that when I discovered this years ago, I couldn't believe this was allowed. It's less work too. The average compact keywords page is only 415 words. Compact Keywords is a 13-hour deep course on getting sales with SEO. A customer recently said, "Each lesson is dense with information. You're giving years worth of experience boiled down into 15 to 30-minute lessons with no filler or fluff. I feel like I'm gaining a new superpower." Compact Keywords is about setting up an SEO funnel that brings you sales for years and years and years. It works with AI, it's less work than traditional SEO, and it makes way more money. You can get it now at compactkeywords.com. Back to the podcast.
So it's really, really important.
Yes, it was literally life and death. You would rather die than lose dignitas. It was more important than money. Money was just a tool to gain more dignitas.
It sounds in marketing, there's this term, top of mind awareness. And you always want to be like, for example, if you're selling services and somebody thinks of your niche, you want your brand to be top of mind for them, because then they're going to go to you and to not a competitor. And I mean, it's the same in politics. It's like it's a popularity contest in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So being top of mind, crazy important in the modern day. There's lots of different ways of doing that. You said some of the ways that Rome did it. It was gladiator games. It was big speeches, all sorts of events. What were some of the top things? Or, oh my gosh, and today you have like viral antics that you will see on social media. What were some viral antics that I guess big Roman politicians or people did?
Well, I mean, one of the things that you get in ancient Rome is you have, particularly in the late Republic again, is a lot of scandals. So just like today, people like to gossip about sort of scandalous behavior of celebrities or politicians. It was the same thing then. So it's kind of what you would expect. It was lots of accusations of sexual misconduct or, being drunk in public. There was one time when Mark Antony liked to party a lot. So he had a big party the night before, and he comes to the Senate, and he's so hung over that during the Senate meeting, he has to vomit. And so he sort of vomits into a fold of his toga. And so his opponents were able to use this as kind of evidence of, oh, he's not a serious politician. Look, he's too much, dedicated to this party lifestyle. So, I mean, those kinds of things could be huge. There were rumors one time where Caesar snuck into the sacred religious rites of an all-female sort of cult, that he dressed up as a woman literally to sneak into this. And of course, there are also rumors that he was having an affair with one of the women who was hosting this whole thing. So, I mean, those sorts of things would have, in modern terms, gone viral. Everybody in Rome would have been talking about, was Caesar really there? Did he do this? And it's almost less important, the truth of it. Like, did he really do these things, as how that affects his public standing, as public reputation. And like today, some of these things might, technically be bad. I mean, obviously, Mark Antony's behavior is bad, or Caesar's behavior is bad, but in a weird way, it also might have enhanced their popularity. I mean, maybe the common soldiers were like, well, he's just a party boy like us. So, with certain segments, it might have enhanced their reputation, whereas with other segments, the very same behavior could harm their reputation. So it's very complicated. I mean, you have all these things in play at once.
Did ancient Rome's ability to shape public opinion help them hold power longer?
Well, that kind of takes us to that second level, right? So we've been talking about internal politics. And then there's how the Romans portrayed themselves to outside people. What did they think about? How did they attempt to portray Roman culture or Roman civilization? And this is an interesting question because early, not even just early, I'd say the first 500, 600, 700 years of Roman history, I don't think they really thought about this at all. They were just kind of doing their thing. But once they conquered the Mediterranean basin, Once they had mostly conquered almost all the shores of the Mediterranean, so about 2nd, 3rd century BC, all of a sudden they become much more self-conscious about Roman culture. What are the values that define it? What makes us distinctive as a people? And you can start to see this coming out in Roman authors. So probably the most obvious example is in the 1st century BC, the Roman historian Livy writes this enormous history of Rome. So he starts with the foundation of the city and goes up to the present day. And when he's writing about the early history of Rome, so he's writing about time 600-700 years before himself, he's obviously very self-consciously trying to create a pantheon of heroes, of kind of founding fathers and founding mothers that will provide that sort of glorious start to the civilization that matches its current success. So at the time the Romans were doing this, they were just one people living in mud huts. They weren't thinking, oh, we're going to be this glorious civilization. But once they had conquered the Mediterranean, it's almost like they have to retroactively go back and say, well, wow, we turned out really well. We now need some appropriately glorious beginnings and appropriately sort of heroic figures to be our kind of, to form the myth of the foundation of Rome. So he writes these stories about guys like Mucius Scaevola, Horatius, Cincinnatus, all these Roman heroes who may have been real people, but it's not entirely clear that the stories Livy tells are entirely factual. They're sort of halfway between history and myth. But each of them embodies some very clear values. So these are didactic stories, meaning they teach values. So, one of them exemplifies bravery, another self-sacrifice, another determination, another, they all represent a sacrifice for the common good. So you're not as important as the state. You sacrifice yourself for the good of the state. Some of them are paragons of moral integrity. And these are the stories that Roman mothers and fathers would tell their kids. So this is how you produce new Romans. You tell them these stories about these founding heroes, and they're role models. They're like, well, this is who founded supposedly our culture. These are the values that are most important to us. And this is now the expectations for how you have to behave. So again, to what degree these early Romans actually embodied these values, you can debate. But what's important is this is how the Romans wanted to see themselves, and it's how they wanted others to view them. So I always give my students a bunch of stories in Livy, and I say it's not important whether this stuff is true or not. But if you want to understand the Romans, you have to understand who they wanted to be, who their ideals were, and how they projected themselves to others. And if you can understand the ideals of society, you start to get a good handle on understanding that society, right? So these stories are very important for how the Romans, in essence, marketed themselves. Livy is how the Romans marketed themselves. He defines what does it mean to be a Roman, and how do we want ourselves to be seen? What are the expectations if you are a Roman? And let me also add, go ahead, yeah.
Oh yeah, please. Oh no, well, this is really interesting because I think lots of us, we have our own stories for our businesses or our brands that we feel should be shared. But how do we actually get people to pay attention? When these stories were created, how did people pay attention to them and spread them? How did they get shown to the public?
I mean, for the Romans, it's like hero stories, right? So these do become almost, I want to say, bedtime stories you tell your kids. And they would reinforce this in things not just verbal, and this is a very verbal society. So stories matter. This is a culture where people are used to conveying stories verbally, but they would also do it visually. So, if you go into the heart of a Roman city, what you would see are a bunch of columns with statues on them. And who gets depicted? It's probably a lot of these heroes. So walking around your town, you would say, oh, there's a big statue of Horatius defending the bridge from the Etruscans. He's one of these big heroes. And then you'd go home and you'd hear a story about this same guy. So, I mean, even in a culture without, the internet or TV or any of these things, they're looking at both sort of, visual media to convey these stories and, verbal media. And things like coins. I mean, during the Republic, the Romans would not depict living Romans on coins. They start doing that during the Empire when they put the emperor on the coins. But in the Republic, you would have some image on the coin, and sometimes it would be one of these mythical heroes, right? Or some reference to them. So again, your money itself is reminding you of some of these stories. So there were a lot of ways they could do this, even as society with a much lower level of technological sophistication.
I'm just thinking if it's a long or detailed story, how does the government actually get the full story out there? Because I can't imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, I can't imagine just a statue would do it justice.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that, today there's so much information, right, that we get overloaded. In a society like this, there's a lot less kind of just information floating around. So there wouldn't have been as many stories floating around, but the ones that were there were easier for everybody to hear because they were the only ones, right? So, I mean, if you were looking for some story to tell, it's not like you have Netflix with infinite movies to choose from. You had Livy in this set of heroes. So I think there was, in modern terms, there was more of a uniform culture, which in a way is like, something like the United States used to be. I can remember when I was growing up in the 70s, there were 3 network channels and everybody knew what was on them. So, I mean, in Rome, there's one channel, right? And so everybody kind of knows what's on it. And Rome was very concerned also with communicating in symbolic terms their dominance over the Mediterranean. So this is, again, a message they're sending both to themselves and to people viewing them. And I always say that the city of Rome, by about the 1st century BC AD, you can almost view the entire city as a sort of giant trophy case celebrating Roman imperialism. Because everywhere you look, you would see huge, glorious buildings. And those buildings, temples, stoas, basilicas, they were constructed with the loot taken in Rome's conquest. And they were decorated often with carved images of Romans killing foreigners and stealing their stuff. And the people who built these buildings, many of them were slaves captured in those wars. And the very stones were drawn from all over the Mediterranean and imported to Rome. So you would have, purple marble from the quarries in Egypt. You would have gray-white marble from the quarries in North Africa. You would have white Pentelic marble from the quarries in Greece. And all of this would be put on ships, sent to Rome, and used to construct these buildings. So you could look at a Roman forum, the Forum of Trajan, and almost take a tour of the empire. Because you could tell, well, this is from that place, we conquered them. This is from this other place, we conquered those guys too. This is from that place, we conquered them. And if you went into a Roman temple, it would be stuffed to the gills with armor, flags, swords, paraphernalia, again, that you had taken from foreigners you had killed. There were something like 50 triumphal arches in Rome. So each one of these arches celebrated a military victory of the Romans over some foreigners. And each arch has carved on it images of Romans killing foreigners and stealing their stuff. So, I mean, everywhere you looked in the city, you would be reminded Rome conquered everybody. And if you went to a gladiator game, what do you see there? You see captured prisoners of war from all over the world and exotic animals from all over the world dying for the pleasure of Roman citizens. So again, it's this symbolic statement, we can do this. We've conquered everybody else. They now are performing for us. Their money is used to decorate our capital. Their lives are expended for our pleasure. So Rome was very, almost, I want to say, heavy-handed in the way it said, we have conquered you guys, and our entire capital city is a monument celebrating Roman imperialism. So this is one of the dark sides of Rome, right? This is Rome saying, we are the empire, we've conquered you.
Super dark. I mean, so that's a lot of what people think of. How did people who were not on the inside, who weren't seeing these grand temples and all the different materials and everything that was plundered, people who were on the outside, how do they find out Rome is the dominant power?
I mean, you find out because where's the army? It's posted on the frontiers. So your encounter with the Romans is through its military, which is a very efficient military machine. The interesting thing, though, with the army, though, is that you have 2 components to the army. You have the legionaries, who are Roman citizens, And then you have an equal number, so about 500,000 each of legionaries and this other group called the auxiliaries. And the auxiliaries are non-citizens. So they're usually warlike people drawn from areas recently conquered by Rome, where they'll enlist them into this auxiliaries to the Roman Empire. And when they serve in the auxiliaries, they basically learn Latin, they learn Roman customs, they learn to sort of identify with the Romans, they maybe learn to wear togas, to appreciate art, literature, whatever. And they serve in the auxiliaries fighting for Rome for, let's say, 25 years. And at the end of that time, when they're discharged, what do they get? They get Roman citizenship. So the auxiliaries are this gigantic machine which takes in potentially dangerous foreigners, newly conquered people who might otherwise turn into rebels fighting against Rome, and it Romanizes them. And in the auxiliaries, you'll be told stories from Livy about Roman heroes. So they'll become your role models, your heroes. And at the end of the time, you're a Roman. And your kid, probably, if you're one of those auxiliaries, then joins the legions because he will have citizenship from your citizenship. And all of a sudden, these potentially dangerous foreigners have been transformed into very loyal and fanatic Roman citizens. So one of the secrets to Rome's success is they're extremely open to incorporating new people into their culture. Romanness is not an ethnicity. There's no race of Romans. There's not even an ethnic group. It's an identity formed by sharing this culture. And so, by the 2nd century AD, the Roman Senate is mostly people born in the provinces. It's Spaniards, it's Syrians, it's people from modern, North Africa. The army is composed of people who are primarily not Italians. So it's important to remember that pretty quickly, Rome just incorporates all these people into itself and kind of transforms them culturally into Romans. When they invade Britain, I mean, as far as you can get from Rome, right? What do? They start building little Roman baths and temples. And Tacitus, this author who talks about this, and through these things, we lured the locals into enjoying the fruits of Roman civilization. We taught them to wear the toga. We taught them to enjoy baths. So you're taking kind of, in the Romans' eyes, savage British tribesmen and sort of transforming them into Romans. Another sneaky thing the Romans would do is when they conquered area, let's say Britain, they would often sort of get the sons of the chieftains and send them to Rome. So they would grow up in Rome as sort of honored guests, learning Roman culture. And then when they send them back to Britain and become the next generation of chiefs, they're actually often working in collusion with the Romans. So the Romans are very good at this stuff. They're very good at selling their culture to others and incorporating people into it.
That's amazing. That reminds me of like coming and studying in the United States or something like that. So indoctrination was so important. Were there people who and creating the stories and the lore, were there people who or teams who focused on shaping how Rome was seen?
I mean, not in a formal way. So the collective effect of all this is, yes, that sort of happens, but it's not like there's a, ministry of propaganda or something churning this out. And I don't know how deliberately the Romans did it. It just sort of evolved, and what they were doing worked really well in this context. So yeah, I mean, one of the questions is how deliberate was all this as policy? Certainly stuff like, raising the chieftain's sons of Rome, they were thinking, yeah, this is a way to make these people Roman. The auxiliaries, I don't know if they start out thinking, oh, this is a way we'll create new citizens, or if it was just like, well, we need to divert these people from fighting against us. Let's have them fight for us. But the net effect after centuries was, yeah, it's this amazingly efficient mechanism for achieving these things.
How much of Rome's success was due to their ability to indoctrinate people or newly conquered people and spread these stories and spread these messages?
Yeah, I would say a lot. I mean, like I said, it's civilizations thrive and expand, but if they stay very exclusive, they tend not to last. So, if it's founded on one little group and they keep saying, well, that group is going to be the one that stays in charge, it's not going to last 1,000, 2,000 years probably. But the Romans were able to kind of refresh themselves with new blood, I guess. It sounds sort of literal, but by constantly kind of bringing in these outsiders and turning them into Romans culturally. So, yeah, I think that was one of the principal reasons for their success. I mean, there's also some cultural stuff. It's those values. The Romans had this kind of insane, fanatical determination. So they're the kind of people that early on they lose, I almost want to say, a majority of their wars. So it's not like they have a better military. It's not like they have higher level of technology, but they just never give up. I mean, they fought, 6, 7 separate wars against some of the other Italian people, the Samnites or whoever, and they lose and they lose and they lose, but they just keep coming back. And in the end, they wear down their opponents. So, I mean, there are some kind of cultural things that make the Romans successful, that sort of never give up attitude. And then there's these policies of incorporation of foreigners and really using them to strengthen your empire rather than become elements that are going to weaken it from within.
Man, there's so many things I would think about. 'Cause I'm reminded of when you were talking to Lex about how they kept raising armies to go against Hannibal. And yeah, completely relentless.
Yeah.
And yeah, okay. I want to talk about Augustus, because it seems like Augustus was really a master of like early personal branding, and personal branding now in 2025 is so important. And I'm very curious what we can learn from Augustus. So could you talk about how Augustus crafted his public image?
Yeah, he was a master of this. But one thing to just sort of note is that he didn't invent this stuff. So he's building on certain traditions. So by the time Augustus comes along, first century AD, late first century BC, there had been leaders who were very self-consciously crafting their images for centuries. So to take an obvious example, Alexander the Great. He lives 300 years before Augustus, but he clearly is someone who thought of himself as having, in modern terms, a brand. So he deliberately cultivated this kind of youthful, dynamic image. He associated himself with certain deities and portrayed himself as those deities on coinage. Alexander had this distinctive hairdo, right? He had this big kind of puffed up, wavy, almost bouffant hairdo that appears on all his coins and statues. And it's so distinctive that just like, a celebrity today might inspire others to emulate their hairstyle, for centuries after Alexander the Great, anybody who wanted to be a conqueror would puff up their hair in this Alexander style because they're hoping to capture some of that Alexander magic. The pharaohs of Egypt, the rulers of Babylonia or the Assyrians, they were also very proactive in trying to portray themselves in contemporary media and in sculpture and in poetry. But let's get to Augustus. I mean, one could argue that he took deliberate manipulation of one's image to a new level of sophistication. And Augustus was a very clever guy. And his challenge was he wanted to take over Rome and rule it as one person. But traditionally, the Romans hate kings, and a king is one person in charge. So how do you do this? How do you rule Rome as one person, which all these politicians aspire to, but not get killed? And Augustus's adoptive father, Julius Caesar, right before him, had succeeded, of course, in taking over Rome. He had won all these civil wars, but he had acted arrogantly. He had sort of wanted to be a king, it seems, and he had treated the Senate with disrespect. He hadn't been humble. And what happens, as we all know, on the Ides of March, he gets assassinated for it. So Augustus sees that. He says, okay, you can win the battles, but how do you rule Rome as one guy? And his answer is basically propaganda. So Augustus did all these things. The very titles he took disguised his power. He doesn't call himself king. He doesn't call himself, anything. He hid it behind these nice sounding words. He's princeps, which means first citizen. What the hell does that mean? What's a first citizen? It means he's above the other citizens, but he means it's just a regular citizen too. He called himself pater patriae, a father of the country. And on the one hand, this sounds very kind and benevolent. Oh, a father loves his people. He takes care of his children. But on the other hand, keep in mind, in Roman society, A father has literally the power of life and death over his kids. So all these titles are kind of interesting, ambiguous mixes of humble on the one hand, but also very powerful on the other. The title we're calling him by, Augustus, that wasn't his original name. His original name was Octavian. Augustus is derived from Roman religion. And in Roman religion, something that is Augustus has two definitions. It's either someone who is very pious, who is very, worships the gods in a very humble way, or something that's Augustus is something that is itself divine. And again, that ambiguity. It's like, well, on the one hand, he's saying, calling myself Augustus, it just means, oh, I'm very pious, I worship the gods. But on the other hand, maybe there's something special and divine about me too. And he rides the line of that ambiguity all through his career with kind of being powerful, but not looking like it. He does this very clever thing where how do you control Rome? You have to hold the public offices, right? The elected offices. But if you hold all the offices, then nobody else can hold them, and it creates resentment. So Augustus does this thing where he gives himself, or has the Senate, I should say, give him the power of all the offices in the Roman government, but not the office itself. So the Romans go on electing people to these offices, and officially there's 2 consuls every year who are the guys in charge of the government. There's tribunes who do other things, and they're just, on the surface, it looks like they're the ones in charge, but kind of floating behind them, here's Augustus who has the same power. So anytime he wants, he can pop up, step in, and use that power and override everybody else, but on a day-to-day basis, he's not doing it. So he can say, I'm not in charge. We have 2 consuls. We elected them. They're the guys in charge of the government. But everybody knows if he needs it, he can step in and exercise equivalent power. So that's Augustus. He's constantly sort of hiding his power. I love the fact that he wrote his own autobiography. And remember, this is a guy who conquered the entire world, right? Basically known world at the time. And what would you call your autobiography if you had conquered the whole world before the age of 35? I mean, you might say, how I conquered the world at the age of 35. Well, Augustus calls his autobiography the Res Gestae, which is a Latin term, and kind of loosely translated to English, it means stuff I did. I mean, it's the most understated thing. And he starts it off not by boasting about all the titles he held, which is the normal thing to do. Instead, he starts off boasting about all the titles that were offered to him that he turned down. So he's trying to show this humility. And he did all this other stuff. I mean, he didn't dress like a king or an emperor. He just dressed in ordinary toga like a plain citizen. He didn't live in a huge palace like the later emperors. He lived in just a normal house like a normal aristocrat. He didn't eat huge banquets. He ate simple food like any ordinary Roman citizen. So for him, for Augustus, it's very clear what mattered to him was real power, but not the trappings of power. So the way he avoided assassination was by having real power, but otherwise seeming very humble, trying to convince everyone he's just another citizen. So he was smart. He was really smart. He cracked the riddle of how do you rule Rome as one man, like a king, but not get killed for looking like a king.
Super humble. This is kind of a loaded question, but I'm really curious. Do you ever think about who a modern day Augustus would be?
I don't think we have one. I mean, that's what makes Augustus great. I mean, he sets the paradigm for the next 2,000 years. Every ruler in Europe wants to be like Augustus. He's their role model, and he does it better than anyone that follows. So I think people have not figured that out. I mean, they haven't figured out that sometimes it's better to have real power, but just not look like it. So I'm not sure there is a modern equivalent. People today really want that adulation. They want the fame. They want to appear to be in charge. Even the ones that pretend to be humble, which, okay, Augustus was pretending to be humble too, but he really lived it. He did it in a way that I think others haven't managed to emulate as successfully.
I think, though, that's why I don't know if we see this as much anymore, but we used to see politicians, they weren't as open with their lifestyles, and they didn't want people to know the lavish lifestyles that they lived, or the very nice houses that they stayed in, the meals that they had. They wanted to be perceived, like you said, as humble.
Sure, and they always do this. I mean, every person running for public office will show up in a local diner or something and say, "Look, here I am eating my, food just like an ordinary person." But it's so obviously, a photo op. It's so obviously staged, and you get those hilarious things where, they don't know what to order or how to eat a slice of pizza or something. I can't remember who it was. Somebody like, got a slice of pizza and started cutting it up with a knife and fork. It's like, no, you're not an ordinary person. So yeah.
I'm from New York City, and I remember when I was younger hearing about Bloomberg riding the subway, and I'm like, wow,
Yeah.
that's so cool. Bloomberg is riding the subway just like me.
Yep.
Just like me. That's amazing. Okay, so can we go back to the images and the symbols and the stories that Augustus used?
Sure. Like what aspect exactly?
So what elements what elements was he using to spread this the perception that he was trying to create?
Yeah. Well, it was really interesting this was very influential on me. When I was just started grad school, this book came out by a German scholar, this guy Paul Zonker, and the book is called "The Power of Images in the Age of Augustus," and it looked at exactly this issue. So it was a brilliant study of the specific images and media that Augustus used to project the things he wanted to. So, it looks at how he used coin portraits. It looked at how he used architecture. It looks at the temples he built. And every temple wasn't a random temple. It was chosen to send a political message. So when he, avenges the death of Julius Caesar, he builds a temple to Mars, who is the god of war and sort of violence. But it's not just to Mars. He builds a temple to Mars Ultor, which is a special aspect of Mars that has to do with revenge. It's literally Mars the Avenger. And so by putting up this temple, it's a reminder, hey, I avenged the death of my father. He puts up a temple to Apollo, and Augustus often tried to kind of associate himself with Apollo for various reasons. And so he puts this right next to his house. And so it's kind of like, well, he's conflating himself with this god, saying, I have some of these attributes, but again, not in this kind of obnoxious way. So he's very good at doing all this stuff. He puts up the Areopagus, famously, which you can go see in Rome today. It's still by the side of the Tiber in this special building. And it's simply, officially, it's just an altar. So a place you perform sacrifices. But the altar is actually surrounded by this marble screen. So kind of 4 marble walls. And these walls are just totally covered, every inch of them, with very fine and elaborate carvings. And every single thing on these carvings has a symbolic meaning. So even the vegetation symbolizes something. There's little bull skulls which symbolize something. I mean, there are literally multiple books written breaking down the symbolism and iconography on the Areopagus. And the thing itself is that not just an altar, it's the Areopagus, which means the altar of peace. So again, he's sending this message, I'm the guy who brought peace. Our world was at war, but I've brought peace and made everything prosperous and happy. So this is after he kills all his enemies. That's how he creates peace. It's again, the whole thing is just obvious propaganda. And what does he put up in front of the Areopagus? He puts a bunch of tablets inscribed with the res gestae, the stuff I did. So his autobiography. So everyone who walked by this thing in Rome would see, oh, Augustus, he brought peace. Look, he put up this altar. Look, there's an image of him with his family. He's a nice father. Look, he's got the little kids on his knee or something. Oh, and here's his account of how he did all this stuff, which is very modest and understated, but yet sort of it makes the argument, I'm the all-powerful person too. So yeah, he used all these very clever methods. And even the way he got into power was by manipulating image. So remember, Augustus's big rival, the person he had to defeat to become the first emperor, was Mark Antony. So after Julius Caesar was assassinated, Mark Antony was Caesar's sort of a right-hand man, his lieutenant. And everyone expected that Mark Antony, who was an experienced general, was a very good general, would just take over and kind of step into Caesar's shoes. Augustus at the time, known as Octavian, was just a teenager, so nobody took him seriously. But through a war of propaganda, Octavian or Augustus managed to raise himself almost up to the level of Antony, this experienced general. And then he really almost won the war, because eventually the two guys fight this big war by waging a war of propaganda against Antony. So, for example, Antony famously has an affair with Cleopatra, who was the queen of Egypt. And Egypt at this time was a foreign kingdom. So it's a separate country. It's not yet conquered by Rome. So Octavian was able to spread rumors. So here we talk about the role of rumors. He was able to spread rumors that Antony is really kind of under the control of Cleopatra, that she's, seduced him with her sexiness and is manipulating him into doing whatever she wants. And if Antony ends up winning this civil war between me and Antony and he becomes the ruler of Rome, it won't be Antony in charge, it'll be Cleopatra. So Octavian's or Augustus's message is, if you back Antony, the person who ends up ruling Rome will be a foreign queen. And remember, Romans don't like to be ruled by foreigners, and they don't like kings or queens. So this is appealing to these very visceral impulses in Roman society that, look, you need to support me because I'm the real Roman, and if my opponent wins, you'll end up being ruled by this foreign queen, which is a terrible thing. And this is all propaganda, right? It's probably not true, whatever. He spread another rumor. He says, if Antony wins, he's going to move the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Egypt, again, because of Cleopatra. And the people in Rome are going to say, no way, we don't want that. We like being the capital of the empire. But they believed it. So this is a rumor. I mean, Augustus made it up. It's not true, but it was a believable rumor, because Antony did seem to be very much in love with Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt. Maybe he really would move the capital to Egypt. So this is this war of propaganda that helped build him up and tear down Antony. And in the end, he does defeat Antony militarily, but he defeats him first in the war of propaganda. And that's a key element.
But I think all of that was interesting, but what stuck out to me was how Augustus spread these bits of his lore across the different elements. They're kind of like media channels that he had. And he spread different bits of his lore so it would become easy to binge on his story.
Yep.
And binge on, I talk about content marketing a lot on this show. And you build up a body of work and you want to make it easy for people to go down the rabbit hole of your body of work. And that's why if you have a website, when you put up an article, in your article, you link to other articles. And then those articles link to other articles. And you have, like I have this show on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and people listen to one episode, they go down, they listen to another, they listen to another. And I talk about it too. I share, I mentioned this on this show. I mentioned this on this show. And then it becomes very easy to pay a lot of attention and create a lot of top of mind awareness because people are binging on your lore and on your stories and on the things that you did. Very quickly, I'm curious what it would actually be like, just a day in the life of a random citizen in ancient Rome who would be exposed to Augustus, and how would you experience this image of Augustus that he is crafting? How, like, as just a random lowly citizen, experiencing day-to-day life, what would it be like?
Yeah, I mean, if you're living in the city of Rome, you're in a privileged position because that's the emperor's city. He's usually physically present, and he will make these sort of public appearances. So it's very important for the emperor's legitimacy to appear before the people and to receive their acclamations. So acclamations are applause or literally shouted stuff where you say, "Hail Caesar," And so there was pressure on Roman emperors to regularly show up in public venues where they're kind of exposed to the people. So they would show up at gladiator games. They would show up at circus races. They would show up in the theater. And this is an interesting moment because it's both good for the emperor because it affirms his legitimacy. When he shows up and enters the circus and 200,000 Romans shout, "Hail Caesar," that puts a stamp on you that you're the legitimate Caesar, right? But it's also a moment of danger for the emperor, because when he enters that space, he hopes that they'll applaud. He hopes that they'll all shout something complimentary. But it's also a chance for the people to do the opposite, to boo him, to hiss him, to not applaud, or to shout something negative, or to make a demand. And so it's this kind of two-way interaction where each side has something to risk and something to gain. and so this kind of public appearances are very fascinating, because some emperors who were unpopular did not want to appear in public. So Augustus's successor, Tiberius, was not particularly popular with the people. He didn't put on a lot of shows. He didn't build public works. And he didn't like to show up at public games because he might get a negative response. And that would undermine his legitimacy. The people might make demands. The Romans were very good at kind of chanting things in giant masses. So it's like when you go to a football game today, or more like a soccer game, particularly in Europe, you'll have these chants that people would do. And the Romans had their chants too, and a lot of them are complimentary. But once you have a rhythmic rhyming chant, it's pretty easy to substitute something else into that formula and change it to, let's say, from praise to change it to a criticism. And sometimes this would happen. Sometimes this would happen to emperors, and it would be a disaster. So if you're an ordinary Roman citizen in the city of Rome, you're special because you regularly have direct access to the leader, and you actually, at least collectively in large groups of tens of thousands, have the ability to make demands of him, to express your degree of approval of what he's doing. And in a way, in the empire, the Roman people's votes no longer matter that much, but their cheers and applause in public spaces do. And it's interesting when the capital city starts to move outside of Rome. So in the later Roman Empire, when there's multiple capitals at certain points, when the empire splits into 2 or 4 sections, when the emperor is simply moving around a lot because there's crises on the frontier, whenever a new imperial palace gets built in some city in another province, the very first thing they build next to that palace is a hippodrome, an arena for circus racing, because it's appearing in the hippodrome and receiving those chants of Hail Caesar that makes you the legitimate emperor. And this is also a time when there's a lot of infighting, multiple people saying, I'm the real emperor, and you have these civil wars. Well, who's the real emperor? It's the one who gets the applause of the people. So these kinds of appearances are political. They're not just sporting events. They're political events because they identify who's the legitimate emperor. One other thing I wanted to mention is you're talking about how ordinary people experience the Romans. If we look at the sort of channels of communication. So today people look on, Twitter or, Instagram or whatever, YouTube. What were channels of communication equivalent to that, let's say in the ancient world? And it was things like rumors, which somehow spread. Nobody knows how, but they spread very easily. They were popular songs and slogans. So, and we know these were sometimes political. So people would make up little funny memes, let's call them, little sayings that would get spread around the city and the empire. And sometimes these were criticism of famous figures. So there was a song about Julius Caesar, and the key line in there was, Caesar is every woman's man and every man's woman. So it's catchy, and it's an accusation of promiscuity, right? That he's having affairs with all these women. He's also having affairs with lots of men. But the interesting thing is, the part about having a lot of affairs with women, that's actually sort of complimentary. But the negative part is where it says he's every man's woman. And the problem there isn't that he's having affairs with men. That's okay in Roman society. They have different attitudes about sexuality, but that he's playing the female role in those sexual encounters. And that's bad. So for the Romans, it's not bad if you're having sex with a man, but it's, are you playing the active or the passive role? And this little catchy slogan was implying he was playing that passive role, and this really upset Caesar and blah, blah, blah. So, but it's these songs would spread virally in essence because they're catchy. They have some funny slogan or they rhyme. And then another media that's really interesting is graffiti. So graffiti was huge in Roman society. There's almost a tradition you would put it on walls and stuff. And a lot of it is like modern graffiti. It's so-and-so was here, so-and-so loves somebody, so-and-so hates somebody. But a lot of it was political too. So at Pompeii, we have all the graffiti preserved by the volcanic eruption. And one of the things you get is politicians hiring people to write graffiti, advertising themselves. And there were different kind of social clubs, particularly kind of professional organization guilds, and they would endorse different politicians. So you might have a graffiti that says, the carpenters of Pompeii endorse so-and-so for duovir. That's a local elected office. Or, the sheep sellers or the pottery makers or the blacksmiths. But what's funny is you would get people then exploiting this tradition to say negative things. So you would have someone write on the wall, all the lazy people of Pompeii endorse so-and-so. So it's a fake endorsement. This is written by his enemies, pretending to be a negative group endorsing this politician. So graffiti could get quite sophisticated again, and it was used not just for sort of, as we think of graffiti on the bathroom stall, but it was a political tool as well. And everybody would read this stuff on the walls, and this is another way that Romans kind of communicated with one another.
What were some ways, we talked about this a little bit, but I want to go deeper. What were some times that trying to shape public opinion caused problems, and then what could we learn from that?
So can you mess up, I guess, doing your public stuff? I'll give you one sort of example. I mean, one of the ways that politicians would gain favor with the people is building a building. And usually the idea is this is something that's a benefit to the people. So you build a new bath building, you build a new theater, you build a road. The Appian Way, the most famous road, is named after the guy who built it, Appius Claudius. And after Nero had a famous sort of misstep in this direction. So in 64 AD, there was a huge fire at Rome, the Great Fire. It burnt down 10 of the 14 regions. And Nero, who's kind of crazy and kind of egotistical, decided after this fire, it literally burnt down the center of the city. So there's this big empty space in the center. I'm going to take advantage of this to build a new building there. And what's Nero going to build? A new palace for himself. Now, palaces can be expressions of a ruler's power and authority and all this stuff. So a fancy palace can be a good thing for a ruler, right? And Nero builds this huge, lavish palace called the Golden House. It has an artificial lake. It has 50 different dining rooms. One has a revolving roof. There's gardens, walkways, wall paintings. And right in front of the whole thing, what does Nero put? A 100-foot high, golden, naked statue of himself. Now, this is a little over the top, but it might have been okay. Except, remember, Rome had just experienced a big natural disaster. The people are suffering, they're starving, there's all these issues. And so this was a terrible misstep to build a lavish palace for the pleasure of one person at a moment when the people were suffering. So this actually got a lot of negative publicity from Nero. People really resented that he had spent all this money on this pleasure palace for himself when the city was suffering. And so the next family of emperors who come in after they get rid of Nero is the Flavians. And they see this and they say, all right, we're going to use that mistake to our advantage. So they raise the Golden House and they deliberately build a new building right on the same spot, right where Nero had the Golden House, which is going to be a dedicated building for gladiator games for the pleasure of the people of Rome. And that building is the Flavian Amphitheater, which is better known by its nickname, the Colosseum. So one of our most famous buildings is built, the motivation is to make a symbolic statement that we, the new emperors, are not concerned for ourselves, but we're giving the people this prime real estate in Rome for their pleasure and their entertainment. And by the way, the name Colosseum gets its name, that nickname, because the amphitheater stood right next to that 100-foot high golden naked statue of Nero, and that statue is called the Colossus of Nero. So the building technically is the Flavian Amphitheater, but it's called the Colosseum because it was next to this giant naked statue of Nero. But the Flavians know we can't let it be Nero. So what they do is they put a crown and some rays sticking out of it, and they transform it into a statue of the sun god Helios. So even the statue gets this makeover to take away that thing. It's now not glorifying an emperor, it's glorifying one of the gods, and we're just being pious. So there's an example of how something that seemed like a good idea, oh, emperors should have big palaces, the context matters, right? It matters where you build it, it matters when you build it. And then the Flavians could take advantage of this to make this huge statement. We're now for the people. We're concerned with their pleasure, not our own.
I was at the Colosseum a few years ago, and I was looking at images of Nero's palace with with this huge man-made body of water, and it's just so strange to think that that was there. This man-made body of water was there, and then so brilliant to create this stadium for public events, because the Romans, like, they just understood that these events, they created loyalty, they created awe, people talked about them, they were emotionally charged, they were memorable. What was that like? So it was a blend of entertainment and a blend of propaganda.
Well, I mean, Roman spectacles are famous, and they're a blend of more than that, because technically, gladiator games are also religious ceremonies. I mean, they were originally held as funeral games in honor of somebody who had died. Later, they dropped that, but they still have this religious component. So when you're attending, you're not just attending a sporting event or a spectacle; you're also attending sort of a religious thing. And yeah, I mean, they're intensely emotionally charged things. And they're also, again, the symbolism. I mean, because you have this glorious building, of marble. The Colosseum, for example, was built with the money derived from the looting of Jerusalem. So once again, this is a story of Romans killing foreigners and stealing their stuff. And what do they do with that money? They build the Flavian amphitheater. And then the events held in them are, you have a bunch of Roman citizens, like I said, determining what happens to captured prisoners of war, so foreigners. So again, it's this assertion of Rome's dominance and authority. I mean, there's a lot of sort of anthropological debate about why did the Romans have these blood sports? Why did they think it was okay to have human beings die for their pleasure? And there's a lot of debates about this, where people are, there's the symbolic thing, which I just described, which the Romans themselves, that's what they said their explanation was. Another explanation the Romans offers, they say, well, the Romans are warlike people, so we should be accustomed to the sight of death. So that makes it okay, supposedly. But no, they're pretty cruel. They're pretty horrible by modern morality, certainly. But people enjoyed this, and they had all this important stuff going on. And you mentioned emotion, and emotion's really important in appealing to people, and the Romans understood this. So, like in giving speeches, I mentioned how a big part of Roman life was giving these public speeches, and the Romans were very concerned in their speech giving, not just to appeal to the intellect or the mind, but to appeal to the emotions. So Cicero, who is regarded as the greatest of all public speakers, once said, if you can touch an audience's emotion, you've won, because that matters more than logic, than the facts, than anything else. So the goal is to stir up emotions, because if you can get someone emotionally worked up about something, all that other stuff doesn't matter. And the Romans understood this very well. And a lot of the way, what makes speeches emotionally engaging isn't the words, it's the way you give it. It's the delivery. So you can't be a dull speaker. You can't just sit there and sort of, be a talking head in a monotone. You have to make it exciting. You have to use gestures, body language, all of this. The most famous Greek orator, this guy Demosthenes, one time some guy came up to him and said, Demosthenes, what are the three most important things in being a good public speaker? And they sort of expect it to be, composition, memory, good content. And Demosthenes says, the single most important thing in being a good public speaker is your delivery. And the second most important thing is your delivery. And the third most important thing is delivery. Because they understood that even a crappy speech, if given in a really exciting, engaging way, will be more effective than the most brilliant speech on paper if you just deliver it in a dull monotone. So it's all about touching the emotions of your audience. And the Romans understood that aspect in a way that I feel like many modern public speakers and politicians don't. They don't seem to get that it's not always about the content, it's about how it's presented. And that may not even be a good thing. I'm not even saying this is good. It's just human nature. So that's the way we work, for better or worse, sometimes for worse, but yeah.
And there was almost, I don't want to call it sign language, but it was almost a separate vocabulary for gestures.
Yeah, I mean, this was actually what I wrote my dissertation on. It was my first book. So I'm the guy who wrote about what gestures did the Romans use. And they had it was a sign language, basically. So you were trained when you gave a speech, not just to talk, but to accompany with all these gestures. And the interesting thing about the Roman gestures is they are not like modern ASL sign language. They don't convey the same meaning as the words. Instead, the gestures tell you what emotion you're meant to feel when you hear the words. So your mouth tells you the content, and your gestures, your body language, tells you how that content is meant to make you feel. And the Romans even believed that certain gestures, if I make a gesture, it will make you feel an emotion almost involuntarily. So it's almost like it's not really subliminal because it's overt, but it's almost a way to manipulate the emotions of your audience. That they believed, if I shake my fist, it'll make you feel a certain way. If I go like this, it'll make you feel a certain way. And so when I'm giving a speech, if I'm a Roman orator, I can manipulate the emotions of the audience by my very body language. So that's a really interesting take. And again, it speaks to, I think, to the sophistication of the Romans when they thought about communication. There's a Roman author, Quintilian, who has this book he writes about Roman oratory. And literally there are 60 pages of here's different gestures you make and here's what they mean, here's what they do. So they thought about this a lot. This was something they gave a lot of attention to.
Super useful if people are far away as well and they can't hear.
Yes.
And then they're seeing the gestures.
Yep. This is an era without microphones, and you can actually see a gesture farther than you can hear a voice, particularly in an outdoor setting. So this was a way to kind of get some meaning across when maybe people couldn't hear your words. They could at least kind of figure out what was going on.
I think a lot of great public speaking is it's energy transference. And actually, I want to work more gestures into the way that I speak.
Yeah. It's an interesting area because it's both very powerful, but it can be dangerous too. So if you gesticulate badly, it can undermine the effectiveness of your oratory. So Cicero talks about this too. He makes fun of certain orators for being bad at gesticulation. So he talks about one guy and criticizes him. He says that he kept making these sort of swaying back and forth gestures. So when you listen to a speech from this guy, it looks like he's in a boat that's rocking on the waves. And that's not good. That becomes comic. You become someone that people laugh at rather than that you emotionally move them. So like anything else, if you do it well, it can be a powerful tool. If you do it badly, it can backfire. It can backfire against you.
Can you think of 3 gestures that are emotionally moving?
I mean, some of them are pretty obvious. So like if a Roman slapped their thigh, often it would indicate anger. And that's the same thing. If you clench your fist and press it to your chest, kind of like this, it indicates grief. If you take your hands and you sort of make a push away gesture like this, it shows fear or aversion, that you don't like something. So those all seem, I want to say, that they're kind of instinctive, that I could make those and you could probably guess maybe what the meaning is. Other Roman gestures seem a little bit more arbitrary. So there was a neat one where you raise your hand upright, you curl each of the fingers in sequence, you flip your hand around and open it outwards. So it was sort of, in the video, if you could watch, it's this. And that's a neat gesture. And to the Romans, that meant wonder or amazement. Now, I'm not sure seeing that you would guess that, but knowing that, you might get it. You know what I'm saying? And particularly if you've been raised in a culture to think that if you see this gesture, it indicates wonder or amazement, maybe then it works on you. Another interesting thing is that Roman orators would study Roman actors because actors know how to project emotion to an audience. So Cicero studied with the most famous actor of the day to learn how to be a more effective public speaker, and a lot of that was studying the body language of the actors.
I think so. I went to theater school, and I would say that stage acting is different from acting in film and
Yes,
acting. The
yes.
TV is more exaggerated. I guess you could learn a lot from watching stage actors,
Yeah, so I mean,
even today.
stage actors are a good analogy. And the other thing that stage actors at least used to have to really learn was voice projection, because there are ways you can learn to kind of breathe and sort of project your voice from your diaphragm that allow you to speak loudly to big crowds outdoors. And you can just tell when someone's had that kind of training. I always watch, like Roman movies, and in a lot of the movies, there's always the scene where the general gives a speech to the people, to his army or something before the battle, and sometimes the actors are just saying it in such a way that I'm just sitting there thinking about 20 people would have heard that speech because this guy just can't project his voice. But every so often you'll get an actor, and a lot of them used to be like the old sort of English actors who have been trained in Shakespearean theater, who really knew how to project their voice. And it was much more convincing in those scenes because, yeah, they know how to speak to a crowd without a microphone. And it changes your whole body when you do that kind of projection, just the way you stand, the way you deliver lines. So there was a certain realism to them doing that wasn't present in some of the, I want to say, modern actors who hadn't had that kind of training.
In my early 20s, I actually took lessons on vocal tonality.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just night and day how important it is when you speak in one way and you sound passive and scared. You
Yeah.
speak in another way, you sound completely confident, and it makes people feel.
Exactly.
I really want to talk. I want to switch. I want to talk about the Aeneid,
Mm-hmm.
and because it's a story that it was very important, and it's a story that we almost never got.
Yeah, so the Aeneid is again, it's Augustus.
Thank you.
He's
I've
the key.
mispronounced it. Yes.
Just whatever. So it's the great epic poem by the poet Virgil, written again first century BC, first century AD, and it was deliberately kind of prompted by Augustus, who wanted cultural products celebrating how great Rome was, in particular how great the Rome he had created was. So Augustus patronized poets. He literally kind of paid them to produce these works which would do this. And what he wanted more than anything else was a Roman equivalent of Homer's Iliad. So Homer's Iliad is the great epic poem for the Greeks. He wanted a great epic poem for the Romans. And what he got, well, he probably wanted one that was actually about him. But Aeneas didn't want to write a poem about Augustus. That would have been too sort of transparently propagandistic. So instead, he writes one about, again, the foundations of Rome. And the Aeneid is interesting because what it does is it very deliberately tries to make Rome's origins more glorious by tying the founders of the Roman people first to the gods and then to the Greek traditions. So the Greeks were regarded as kind of higher, more sophisticated culture. The Romans would benefit by sort of tying their history to theirs. So what it does is it says sort of the Roman people were supposedly founded by this guy Aeneas, who was a refugee from the Trojan War. So this links them back to the Greeks. And Aeneas was the son of the goddess Venus. So this means that the founder of the Roman people had divine parentage. And by the way, the family within Rome that claimed they were descended from Aeneas and hence from the goddess Venus was the Julians, like Julius Caesar, and Augustus is an adopted Julian. So now this allows Augustus to claim, hey, Venus is my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. All right, so it's tying them into the gods. And so Aeneas is this guy he's the only Trojan who escapes the destruction of Troy. He goes on this long journey all around the Mediterranean and meets lots of monsters and has all these adventures. And what's going on here is Virgil is imitating Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus goes all around the Mediterranean in a ship and has adventures and meets various people and various monsters. And Aeneas now does the same thing and meets some of the same monsters, in fact. So it's saying our past is just as glorious as the Greek one. One of the things that, all the Greek heroes do at some point in their life is they visit the underworld. It's just a thing you do if you're a Greek hero, like makes you a Greek hero. So what does Virgil do? He has Aeneas go down to the underworld. So he has a little trip to the underworld. So it's like checking off the boxes. This is what you do if you're a legit hero. You go to the underworld, you meet the Cyclops, you meet some witches, you go to this island, you meet some sea monsters. So Aeneas ends up in Italy. He marries a local girl, Lavinia, who's from the Latin tribe. So this is the descendants or the ancestors, the Latins. So we now have this fusion of sort of the Greek past with the local indigenous Latin people. And then it's their kid, not their kid, but down the road a little bit, their descendant, who will be Romulus and Remus, who are the people who actually found the city of Rome. So it's filling in this story, providing this glorious epic myth for the foundation of the Roman people. And the fun thing is that Virgil, I think you were alluding to this, died before he regarded the poem as having been completely finished. And it's not like he didn't get to the end. He was still just fiddling with the content. It was as long as he meant it to be. And in his will, Virgil says, if I die before my poem is finished, destroy it, because I don't want, an inferior product going out. And Augustus stepped in as the emperor and said, no, we are not destroying this thing. We're going to publish it. And yes, it becomes the great epic poem. But it's this act of propaganda, which is very deliberately, very self-consciously trying to provide a more glorious origin story for Rome, and specifically to link them to the gods and to link them to the Greek culture and civilization.
To what extent did it work?
Well, we're still reading it today, right? So, it is a great work of poetry. It is kind of derivative in sometimes comic ways. And what I like, my favorite thing about the poem is I think Virgil actually a little bit resented having to do this. And I think he was a little bit critical of Augustus for having basically killed the Roman Republic and turned it into rule by one man. And I think there's some very subtle things in the Aeneid that are actually criticisms of Augustus. So just the way he talks about some of the characters and things, the way he portrays the heroes. So it both pleased Augustus by providing the thing he wanted. On the surface level, it praises Augustus. So that there's scenes in there, they're just straight up praising Augustus, praising his kids, all this stuff. But at another deeper level, I think it also contains some subtle criticism of Augustus. So this is one of the things that makes it a great poem, is it has all these different levels. It works at multiple different levels simultaneously. And you can argue even how much you think the different elements are there. So yeah, it becomes famous. Everybody knows it in Roman society. It becomes something they advertise and present to others. But it's a complicated work. It's not just simplistic propaganda, which is nice. There's a lot going on within it.
It is interesting though, because the master of personal branding, Augustus, wanted it released, and it has me thinking, like, is there really shame if you're a business and you have a founding story and it's boring or it's not glamorous? Is there shame in sprucing up your founding story to be really interesting and something that people share? Oh, you're not going to believe how this business was started.
Yeah, yes and no. The big advantage that Augustus has here is the founding story is taking place 1,200 years before the present. So, it's back in time. There are no records from back then. So, yeah, you can make up anything you want, and it's not a problem. Today, if, somebody made up untrue stories about Sam Walmart or something, everybody would know the truth because it's not that long ago. So, I think just that distance in time gives a little more leeway than maybe you would have in a similar context today, let's say with a corporation that wants to have a more glorious origin story.
It was easier to lie, and it was and now, like, people can go and look things up. You'd have to be very careful about it. And also, I don't like lying.
Actually, one thing I want to point out, though, is that this is a very human thing to make up untrue stories about your founding father figures. And if we look at the American founding fathers, we see this. And that's not so long ago. 250 whatever years ago, we know what happened then, right? But we do it even with them. So what is the single most famous story about George Washington? It's the one where George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and his father said, "Did you do it?" And little George Washington says, "Yes, father, I did it. I cannot tell a lie." So it's this story, just like Livy, where the virtue is honesty. It's about his honesty. Only problem is it didn't happen. We know that story was made up by a guy named Parson Weems, who wrote a biography of Washington a few decades after his life. So the most famous story about one of our most famous founding fathers is fiction. But again, does that matter? Because the point is, Washington should exemplify honesty, right? And that's the purpose of the story. In the same way that Livy's stories about the Roman heroes, each of them exemplifies one or a set of important values. But yeah, we do this even where we know the truth, right? We know that one's not true, but it's still very popular as a story.
I'm thinking about autobiographies. Very successful people, well-known people, they write autobiographies. To what extent are some of the most famous modern autobiographies? They just have completely false things in them, and I'm sure it's quite a lot.
Yeah.
So, okay, if a digital marketer today asked you, what can I learn from how Rome built influence at scale, what would you tell them?
One is, I think, the importance of visual branding, right? I mean, this is why companies want a logo that everybody recognizes as representing that company. And the Romans are good at this. So if we think about what's the symbol of Rome itself and kind of their army, particularly, it's the eagle. And this is because, every legion had a golden eagle on a pole, which they carried around and was the symbol of that legion. And the worst thing that can happen to that legion was getting their eagle captured. And the Romans are very associated with that kind of eagle imagery. And ever since the Romans, every military likes eagles. So, Napoleon, what did he give his different armies? Each one had a golden eagle on a standard. What did Hitler give his military units? All of them had a golden eagle on a standard. What's the symbol of the US? An eagle. Everybody does this. So it's a powerful image. You see why, eagles seem to be these powerful predatory birds, whatever. Every European kingdom has an eagle on their flag in the Middle Ages or something. That's branding, right? And it's a strong visual element that symbolizes your country. Another thing I would say, and this is something marketing understands, is win them when they're young. If you can hook people on a brand when they're young, and that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the Romans. Like, let's take the kids of the chieftains and raise them as Romans. So we're winning them over to our brand at this impressionable age. And if we hook them then, they'll be Romans for life. And again, sort of, it's the multiplicity of communication avenues. So, Augustus didn't just use coinage, he used architecture, he used symbolism, he used art, he used literature. All these were ways to push a unified message across different communication media. So that multiplicity of methodologies and of routes of communication, I think, is something that holds true today. If you're trying to sell your brand, you can't just do it in one form. You have to kind of reach people through different forms.
The eagles, when I was in Rome, that was something that I just noticed right away. So my first viral TikTok, because I started my TikTok when I was living in Rome. And I started it in Barcelona, but I had one before where I was learning how to do it, and I was in Rome. And I made this video. Wow, look how many eagles there are in Rome. Eagle, eagle, eagle. And I showed all these eagles. And surprisingly, it went really viral. And everyone, what's the name for? It starts with an A, I think.
Aquila.
The name for
Aquila is an eagle.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And everyone's like, this is what it's called. This is why we do it. And eagles are everywhere in Rome. I'm curious about this. So I think Rome was building trust through loyalty, shared identity, but even fear. And which approach seemed to work best? Is there an approach that worked best?
They all can work, right? And it's knowing how far to push certain things. I mean, if you just go all in on fear or intimidation, that creates resentment, right? So it's okay if people are a little worried about you, but if you just entirely rule on that or base your, in this case, civilization on that, it's not going to last, because you'll stir up a lot of people who hate you and they'll all rise up and overthrow you. So I think again, it's that mix, it's complexity. It can't just be a single thing. It has to be a multiplicity of approaches. When I was a teacher, one of my department's goals, we have these learning outcomes. And one of the learning outcomes for the history department was to try and teach our students complexity and nuance of meaning, which is very hard to do. But I think it's important because I think when you look at things simplistically, black and white, this or that, you're never going to understand it fully. Reality is always some shades of gray. It's always multiple possible interpretations. Some may be more true than others, but others may have validity too. So I think it's looking at things in a complex manner. In the same way when we come to marketing, it has to not just be a single thing. You want clarity. You want to know what you're trying to accomplish, and you want a clear message, but you have to approach that in a sophisticated, complex way and through a multiplicity of media. So there's that element of complexity to it.
Yeah, you have the fear, the people who are posted up in your town, and
But
and
it's the
stories that
carrot
you
too.
hear.
It's like, okay, we're if you rebel against us, we're going to stomp on you hard. But if you join us, look, you're going to have access to our culture, our civilization, our baths, our roads, our all this good stuff. There'll be more opportunity. There'll be peace, if you're within the sphere of Rome from outside attackers, at least for a lot of Roman history. There'll be stability. There'll be, everybody is liable to Roman law, which offers a degree of fairness across different classes. So it's carrot and stick. It's both of them together.
All right, this is the last question, and thank you again for coming on the podcast. Let's imagine Julius Caesar had a Twitter account. What would his tone, his style, or strategy have been like? What would it have been like?
Actually, as odd as it sounds, I can absolutely answer this question with absolute confidence because he did this. I mean, not a Twitter account, but when Caesar was away from Rome for 10 years, so a long time up in Gaul, he's conquering Gaul, modern France. He regularly sent back little sort of dispatches telling what he was doing. And his purpose was, I'm out of Rome for 10 years. I'm going to lose that Dignitas competition because I'm not there in person. So I need to be constantly reminding the people what I'm doing to keep myself in their mental eye to compete with all my peers. So he wrote these little accounts of his campaigns as they were ongoing, and he sent them back to Rome in installments. So it's like regular newsletters from Caesar. So this is his Twitter account, right? And what was very memorable about them is the style he used, because a lot of Roman histories or writings are very formal or they're flowery in their prose. Caesar adopted a very, very simple, straightforward, kind of plain spoken style. And again, this is deliberate. This is propaganda. He's saying, I'm an everyman. I'm just an ordinary Joe like you guys. Look, I just write not in this fancy language like the elites, but just like a simple soldier. So he very deliberately wrote it in this simple, straightforward, clear Latin style.
Wait,
Fancy.
this is Sam Altman literally on Twitter. I don't know if you've ever seen his tweets. It's all lowercase.
Yeah.
I don't even know if he uses punctuation.
Yep. So, and this, by the way, is published today is the Gallic Wars. So they collected them all together and published them. And it's the thing that's usually the very first Latin you give to students who are learning Latin because it's so simple and straightforward in its style. It's easy for them to understand. But it's brilliant. And he also, by the way, talks about himself in the third person, which is a little weird. But normally we see that as being kind of egotistical. But in this context, it was meant actually in a humble way. And it's very repetitive. So, half of it is, and then Caesar marched to this town full of these savage people, and he fought a big battle, and he killed half of them, and he enslaved the other, and he stole their cows. And then Caesar marched to this other town and did this and this. And he basically what he's doing is he's reminding the Roman people of all these victories he's winning on their behalf and all this territory and wealth he's adding to their empire. So it's a very deliberate act of propaganda to keep himself in the public mind by doing these things regularly. It's not all at once, it's little installments. And it's in the style that's meant to say, hey, I'm an ordinary guy. I'm not one of these, fancy politicians who's looking down on you. I'm just a hardworking, simple soldier. So yeah, we know exactly what his Twitter feed would be.
So would his tone have been it would have been bold, funny, serious, a mix?
It was pretty dry. So it's there's not
Okay.
a lot of personality in these accounts. So they aren't meant to be entertaining reading. They're just kind of little news bulletins. I mean, it's almost like, in the old days when you had to send like, sort of faxes or teletypes, you had to keep it really short and terse. So it's that kind of thing. It's like, new town conquered, lots of cows, lots of loot, killed a bunch of foreigners, that sort of thing. So it's again, it's not entertaining reading, but it's the content and it's the reminder I'm still out there, I'm still doing stuff.
So, and actually, and then I'm curious, when he's sending these back, how we talked about this a bit before, how is he getting these short messages to spread among the people?
Good question, and we're not entirely sure. So there's a lot of
Okay.
there's all kinds of things we don't know about Roman history. I mean, the sources we have are less than 10% of whatever was written. So how he disseminated this to the public is not entirely certain. I mean, we think this was sort of published in some sort of written form. Certainly, verbally, he would have had a network of people who could have told these stories. And one of the things Roman politicians had that's very important in Roman society is they had client networks. So rich or powerful Romans would be tied to large hundreds, even thousands of people at lower levels who were their clients. And this patron client relationship was very important in Roman society. And sometimes you might end up someone's client because you lived on a certain street and everybody in that street was client to this politician. Sometimes maybe a profession you were in. Sometimes it was just a family tradition. So Caesar would have had access to this large network of clients at Rome at all levels of society, from sort of the middle class, which is kind of a problematic term for ancient Rome, down to ordinary kind of Roman citizens. And no doubt the word would have gone out through that network. Hey, Caesar just won another big victory. Tell all your friends in the bar about this. So that's a way that this could have spread verbally again through this large informal network of clients that every politician maintained. And being a member of the Julian family, it's one of the older families in Rome, it would have had a big, big client network that he could have drawn on.
It's so funny. It's so funny how it relates today, because literally a way that people will boost their posts on Twitter is they will get bigger accounts to comment on their posts.
Yeah.
And then this spreads it. The algorithm spreads it to more and more people. Just you literally just ask. You have a friend who has a big account. Hey, could you leave a comment on this? Oh, great post that you made. And then so many more people see it. And it's
yeah. I mean,
hilarious how
you know the
similar
math
today.
on like pyramid schemes. Everybody tells 5 other people, and pretty quickly you've reached a ton of people. So it's that kind of thing with the client, the patron client network.
I'm sorry. I have one last question, because Julius Caesar was assassinated. Augustus was very successful. How would, if they both have, imagine they both have Twitter accounts. How does Augustus look different from Julius Caesar?
Well, okay, Caesar was interested in, I'm a great conqueror. Here's what I'm doing. And that's what his was. So it was kind of one dimensional, let's say. And where Caesar clearly failed, and what he failed to do was to put himself in the mindset of people who might have been opposed to him. So he was not good at anticipating how his arrogant actions would offend elements of the Senate or even some of the common people. Augustus, I think, would have thought about all that. So he would have been much more self-conscious about, I have to think about how I appear to different segments in society, and I have to craft a different message for these different segments. And we can see him doing that. I mean, Augustus would do things that were clearly aimed at the Senate to please them. There were messages that were clearly aimed at the common people. There were messages that were clearly aimed at the soldiers. There were messages that were aimed at foreigners. So I think, again, he was just a more sophisticated political operator. And his would have been sort of like, I guess, different channels, right? Appealing to different people and with a carefully crafted message for each, in a way that Caesar was much cruder. He thought, okay, I'm in opposition to the Senate. I'm going to be popular with the people. So he would do things that would enhance his popularity with the people. And he kind of did things that really pissed off other elements of society. Whereas Augustus was much more concerned with, I have to try and make sure I craft an appeal that works to everyone so that I don't alienate completely one group.
Gregory, thanks again for joining.
Thank you. It's a fun conversation.
We talked about being able to binge on how important it is to be able to binge on somebody's content. Where can everybody binge on your stuff?
I mean, I've written lots of books and stuff. Some of those are aimed at general audience. But probably the best thing would be I've done 7 audio video courses with the Great Courses, the teaching company. And so those are on, Amazon, Audible, or directly from the teaching company themselves. I've done, 2-part Roman history course. I've done a global history course. I've done a bunch of military history. I've done Roman film ones. So that'd probably be a place you could listen or hear to my stuff most easily. So search my name, Gregory S. Aldrete, and Great Courses. And hopefully it'll be on some platform you have.
Thank you again. And everybody, this is episode 720 of my daily digital marketing show. 720 days in a row doing this crazy podcast without missing a day. 720 consecutive days. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you again tomorrow. Bye now.